Today's talk is about law and development. Now, what is law and development? Now, the simple answer is that it's a legal discipline. Law and development is a legal discipline that examines or considers the relationship between legal institutions and notions of development. Very straightforward, but not very satisfying. Another way of looking at it would be to say that, or perhaps a more textured answer to the question, more perplexing answer perhaps, would be to say that law and development is an idea. A prominent law and development scholar, David Trubeck, has said that law and development is an idea motivated by a goal. Now, which goal exactly is debatable? We can think of this in terms of good governance. We can think of this in terms of democratization, the end of conflict, promoting human rights, promoting ideas of justice. We can go beyond that and say establishing the rule of law. When we're thinking of that, of law and development, we have to think of ideas and we have to think of goals. The ones that I left out, the elephant in the room, if you will, is the economy, economic growth, development as economic growth. So improvements to trade, finance, the economy, notions of market freedom. We can say that law and development is in fact quite an ambitious project. It's an ambitious project, though, with a very short history. Now, the timing of law and development's birth, if you will, is, however, I would say, quite relevant here. So in addition to being post-World War II, law and development emerged during the post-World War II period. So in addition to being post-World War II, law and development also emerged during the pre- and post-independence struggles of former colonies. In fact, if you think about it, you can say that law and development really became a doctrine as independence struggles, third world independence struggles, were underway. Now, its location on or locating, if you will, law and development on a historical timeline is relevant because it highlights this emerging contest between an affluent first world and an impoverished third world. The first world, we have to be clear, over the course of several centuries, had become quite accustomed, we should probably say dependent, upon access to, availability of third world land, third world labor, and third world resources. If we look to the slides here, France must not turn over the colonies to the nationalists in the name of an alleged right to possess the land one occupies, which would leave unutilized resources to lie forever idle in the hands of incompetents. This was Albert Sarraut, who was the French Prime Minister in the first half of the 20th century. We have to think that during the post-World War II period, European powers had essentially pulverized themselves and were very keen on rebuilding their societies. And doing so was going to require access to, once again, third world lands, labor, and resources. Now, of course, the third world was of a different opinion. The third world sought to use this opportunity as a way, or as occasion, to acquire this independence that they had long desired and had long struggled for. Now, to maintain their authority, let's be clear, to maintain their authority, what the First World did was use military campaigns to try to deepen the subordination of third world societies, keep them in check. So we saw this with France. France did this in Vietnam and Algeria. We saw this with the British in Ghana and India. We saw this with the Portuguese in Angola and Mozambique, and the list goes on. And in every one of those situations, violence was used, and significant amounts of violence. Now, of course, we have to recognize that the third world has been a hotbed of struggle a hotbed of resistance. They didn't sit down, idly by, and take all this violence. They resisted. So in none of these situations did imperial powers have an easy time. Now sometimes the struggles occurred in the streets, and we have guerrilla warfare. And other times the struggles occurred in classrooms or lecture theaters. And here we had a form of intellectual warfare that was underway. Now the battles were fierce, but eventually the Third World was victorious. And we see all of these societies succeeded in acquiring their independence. And this is where the Third World Project began. So the Third World Project was a very ambitious attempt to counteract all of these social dislocations that had been suffered by Third World societies. If you think of this along the lines of political economy, and one of the most basic truisms in political economy is that land plus labor can produce a surplus. And with that surplus, one can achieve some form of progress or social advance. So we have land, we have labor, we work the land, we produce a surplus, and then with that surplus, we engage in other activities, whether it's a form of reinvestment, whether it's a trade, an exchange, whatever it happens to be. But it is that that is going to produce this social advancement, the surplus. So if we think historically, what the First World had done has been to expropriate Third World peoples from their land, from their labor, and then to acquire the surplus, which they then used to advance their societies. When we try to understand the divide that exists between the First World and the Third World, we have to look to its colonial roots. So following independence, of course, what the Third World was after was very simple. They wanted to reclaim authority over their land, their labor, and their resources. And by doing so, acquire the surplus, which they could then use to advance their societies. Now, a number of policies were implemented via this Third World Project. One of the first, most important one, land redistribution. Land redistribution. When the missionaries came to Africa, they had the Bible and we had the land. They said, let us close our eyes and pray. When we opened them, we had the Bible and they had the land. Desmond Tutu. Think of this in relation to New Zealand. Here, in 1860, Maori held 80% of the North Island. 1860. By 1890, this was down to 40%, half in 30 years. By 1910, 20 years later, it was down to 27%. By 1939, down to 9%. And by 2000, down to 4%. Land redistribution is a quintessential policy within the Third World Project. What we also had were fairer wages, this desire for fairer wages. What we also had was a desire to expand, to develop their productive base. And we saw the Third World attempt to do this in a number of ways. They did this with import substitution. They did this via protectionism. They did this via regional or South-South collaboration, non-aligned movement, new economic order. So there are a number of policies that were implemented so as to help Third World societies expand their productive base, improve their economies. Third part, cultural equivalency. Is any one society morally superior to another? One thing the Third World wanted to do was counter all of these biases, this bigotry that had colored world history since White Man's Burden, or the French with the Mission Civilisatrice, the civilizing mission. How they had painted the world in this white-black divide. White being representing superiority, advancement, evolution, and black representing savagery and barbarism and backwardness. And the fourth thing that the Third World Project attempted to do was to reinvent the concept of nation. Now we have to understand that European society had been built on imperialism. Third world society had been built on resistance to that imperialism. And so their ideas of what was meant to solidify, to bind them, to create a cohesive nation, were ideals of solidarity, collectivism, independence, justice. So if you look at the Third World Project as a whole, what the Third World Project was trying to do was to achieve what scholars of the time referred to as true freedom. So not just formal equality, not just sovereignty, but true freedom. When we turn to President Sukarno of Indonesia, Third World Revolutionary, who said, and quote, "Imperial powers do not give up their loot easily." This brings us to Antonio Gramsci. Now, Antonio Gramsci was a political philosopher of the early 20th century. Antonio Gramsci is known for many things. One of the things that he is recognized for is the contribution he has made to the concept of hegemony to some people. Gramsci went beyond what scholars of the time we should say, referred to hegemony as dominance. And Gramsci went beyond this, and he said hegemony is not dominance, hegemony is organized consent. Through a number of ideological institutions, we can think of schools, we can think of churches or places of worship, we can think of the media. We have a particular worldview that is circulated, that is disseminated among the masses. And eventually, over time, it is internalized. This worldview, when it's internalized, becomes part of not just individual consciousness, but this collective consciousness. What Gramsci said is that if this indoctrination process were successful, then it makes the use of coercive forces moot. There is no longer the need to use violence because people will consent to their own subordination. Let's use an example to take this out of the abstract. If you were to go on the street today and ask a number of individuals, would you be in favor of a tax hike or a tax cut? I suspect that 9 out of 10, if not 10 out of 10, would say a tax cut. Very few would say a tax hike. Now the thing about it is that if you look at taxes, taxes are paid primarily, as much as we as individuals pay in taxes, goods and sales and income tax, as much as we pay, taxes are paid primarily by the wealthy and by corporations. I'll give you an example. There was this uproar in England recently as it was discovered that, I think it was Lloyd's banks, had only paid less than 1% in taxes in the previous year. They had earned in profit somewhere around 11 billion pounds. And they paid less than 1%. So they paid somewhere around 90 something or 100 million. I think it was 100 or 100, yeah, roughly 100 million pounds. Now 100 million pounds, when juxtaposed next to 11 billion, is nothing. But 100 million pounds, when it's juxtaposed next to the income tax that you generate from millions of people, it's significant. So as much as we're disgruntled about the taxes we pay, we recognize that with a progressive tax rate, which most societies have, the wealthy and corporations will pay the bulk of it, which is justifiable, perfectly justifiable. Now, most people would still support tax cuts. And what tax cuts are is essentially code for service cuts. What tax cuts are is code for education tuition hikes, healthcare fee hikes. And yet everyone who is dependent upon education, upon the healthcare system, upon public transportation, is supportive of something that is going to harm their interests.